You are floating. The air is heavy, thick with the scent of lotus blossoms and the dark, wet earth of the riverbank. It clings to your skin, a humid shroud you can't shrug off. Below you, the Nile slides by, a sluggish serpent of black water mirroring a sky choked with stars. You lie on the deck of the imperial barge, the thrum of its slow progress a deep pulse against your back, a heartbeat that is not your own. It belongs to him. Everything belongs to him. The barge, the river, the stars, and you. Most of all, you. The silk of your tunic is so fine it feels like a cool liquid against your skin, a stark contrast to the heavy gold choking your wrists and neck. The metal is a constant reminder, a physical weight that anchors you to your reality. You are beautiful. You are cherished. You are a jewel, and a jewel's only purpose is to be possessed and admired. You turn your head just slightly. In the flickering torchlight, you can see his silhouette against the velvet canopy of his pavilion. The Emperor of Rome, the master of the world, Publius Aelius Hadrianus. He is not looking at the stars, nor at the shadowy shoreline of Egypt, this ancient land he so adores. He is looking at you. His gaze is a physical thing, another chain settling around you, one made not of gold, but of a terrifying, suffocating affection. You remember your home, Bithynia, a lifetime ago. The smell of the pine forest, the sharp, clean air, the feeling of unremarkable freedom. You were just a boy, handsome, yes, but one among many. Then the world arrived. The Emperor's grand tour, a wave of purple and steel and bureaucracy that washed over your provincial town. His eyes found you, and in that moment, your life, the one you might have had, simply ended. A new one began, one of opulent servitude. You were educated, polished, trained. You learned to speak Greek like a philosopher and Latin like a poet. You learned to walk, to stand, to recline in a way that was pleasing. You were taught the geography of an empire you would cross but never truly see, because your world was not the world of mountains and seas. It was the precise, suffocating space occupied by the emperor himself. Years have passed on this gilded leash. You have seen the misty shores of Britannia and the sun-scorched plains of Judea. You have stood in the shadow of the Parthenon and walked the colonnades of Ephesus. But every step was his step. Every view was through his eyes. He loves you. The poets of the court say so. The sculptors who carve your likeness in flawless marble say so. His own obsessive gaze says so. But his love feels like a sculptor's chisel, chipping away at you, carving you into the shape he desires, until the boy from Bithynia is gone, replaced by this perfect, silent, beautiful thing. Antinous, the emperor's beloved. Now, on this river, a strange melancholy has taken root in your soul, a weariness the perfumed oils and fine wines cannot wash away. You are nearing your 20th year. The soft down on your cheek is coarsening. The lithe grace of youth is solidifying into the muscle of manhood. And in the Roman world, in his world, this is a kind of death. The role of the beloved youth, the Ereminos, has a brutal, unspoken deadline. What happens when the flower petals begin to curl and brown? Where does a living treasure go when its luster fades? He has never spoken of it. The future is a fog, a terrifying void beyond the torchlight of the present. And so, as you lie here, under the weight of the stars in his gaze, a thought, cold and clear as the river water, slides into your mind. A choice, perhaps the only real choice you have had since your world ended and his began. The Nile flows on, indifferent. It promises an escape. It promises a final, silent darkness where his gaze cannot follow. It promises an end to being a beautiful thing. It promises, perhaps, a way to be remembered as you are now, forever. Forever young. Forever his. The water looks like peace. This intimate, terrifying moment, whether it ended in a tragic accident, a desperate sacrifice, or a final, silent act of self-determination, is not merely the prologue to a forgotten love story. It is the epicenter of one of history's most profound and disturbing case studies in the pathology of power. The story of the Emperor Hadrian and the boy Antinous is a journey into the dark heart of what happens when one man's personal obsession is backed by the absolute, unchecked authority of an empire. It is a tale that has been sanitized by time, romanticized by art, and deliberately obscured by those who came after. But to understand it is to understand a hidden truth about the Roman world, that the line between affection and ownership, between adoration and exploitation, could be so thin as to be non-existent. It reveals how grief, when wielded by the most powerful man on earth, could become a creative and destructive force simultaneously, capable of founding cities, birthing a god, and yet, in the process, utterly annihilating the memory of the human being at its center. This is not the story of a lover. It is the story of a ghost, created by a system that deified power and consumed youth. If you find value in exploring these hidden truths of history, in peeling back the veneer of glory to reveal the complex, often tragic, human realities beneath, consider taking a moment to support the channel by hitting that like button and subscribing for more journeys into the forgotten corners of our past. And as we travel together through these stories, I'd love to know where you are on our shared globe. Please leave a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. It is a constant source of wonder that this technology allows us to form a global community, united by a curiosity for the stories that made us who we are. To comprehend the grotesque spectacle that followed the death of Antinous, one must first dismantle the modern perception of a Roman emperor. By the 2nd century CE, the emperor was far more than a mere head of state or a military commander-in-chief. He was the living embodiment of Rome itself. The office, forged by Augustus from the ashes of the Republic, had evolved into a position of terrifying, quasi-divine authority. The emperor was the pater patriae, the father of the fatherland, a title that cast the entire population of the empire as his children, subject to his paternalistic and absolute will. He was the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Roman religion, the final arbiter of the relationship between mortals and the gods. His person was sacrosanct, protected by law and an aura of immense power. An insult to the emperor was not merely slander. It was treason, an act of impiety against the state itself. His whims could become policy, his personal tastes could dictate artistic trends, and his private relationships, far from being his own business, were matters of intense public scrutiny and political significance. He was, in a very real sense, the central gear around which the entire mechanism of the known world turned. When such a man loved, the empire paid attention. When such a man grieved, the heavens themselves were expected to weep. This concentration of power was wielded by a man of profound complexity, Publius Aelius Hadrianus. Hadrian was no simple brute or decadent tyrant in the mold of a Caligula or a Nero. He was by all accounts a genius, an accomplished architect who designed the Pantheon's breathtaking dome and his own sprawling villa at Tivoli. A tireless administrator who spent more than half of his 21-year reign touring the provinces, consolidating the borders, reforming the legal system, and commissioning vast infrastructure projects from Britain to North Africa. He was a man of restless intellect, a Philhellene, a lover of all things Greek, so devoted to Hellenic culture that he earned the slightly mocking nickname Greculus, or the Little Greek. He was a philosopher, a poet, a hunter, a soldier. Yet, this brilliant exterior masked a personality that was often restless, melancholic, suspicious, and capable of startling cruelty. His marriage to Vibia Sabina was famously unhappy, a political arrangement devoid of warmth or affection. Ancient historians like Cassius Dio paint a picture of a man who was perpetually unsatisfied, a tourist of his own vast empire, constantly seeking something to fill a void at the core of his being. He was a man who possessed the entire world, but seemed to find little personal contentment within it. It was this man, with his immense power, his intellectual prowess, his cultural obsessions, and his deep-seated loneliness, who laid eyes on a beautiful boy in the Roman province of Bithynia. The context for this discovery is another system we must understand, one that modern sensibilities find deeply repugnant. the Greco-Roman institution of pederasty. In classical Athens, the relationship between an older man, the erasts, and an adolescent boy, the eromenos, was a formalized social institution, at least among the elite. It was theoretically framed as a mentorship, where the older man would guide the boy in matters of philosophy, politics, and ethics in exchange for the boy's affection and companionship. It was a relationship intended to be temporary, ending when the boy reached manhood and took his place as a citizen, ready to marry and, perhaps, become an eras himself. However, by the time Rome had conquered the Greek world, this institution had been warped by the Roman emphasis on power, status, and dominance. For the Romans, the active role in any sexual relationship was a sign of masculine power, while the passive role was associated with submissiveness, femininity, and lower status. Therefore, a relationship with a freeborn Roman youth was deeply taboo and politically dangerous. The shame fell not on the older man, but on the youth who willingly took a passive role, compromising his future status as a dominant Roman male. This social prohibition created a market. The desire for youthful male companionship did not disappear. It was simply redirected towards those who had no status to lose: slaves, foreigners, and those from the lower classes. The Roman term for such a favorite was delicatus, a living delicacy or pet, a term that strips away any pretense of mentorship and reveals the relationship for what it often was, one of possession and use. These boys were commodities, purchased for their beauty, trained to be pleasing companions, and existing entirely at the whim of their masters. They occupied a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, but devoid of rights, agency, or a defined future. They were living symbols of their master's wealth and aesthetic taste. Antinous, a Greek-speaking boy from a provincial territory, fit this mold perfectly. He was not a Roman citizen in a way that mattered. He was an object of beauty from the culturally superior, yet militarily conquered, Greek East. For Hadrian, the ultimate Philhellene, possessing the most beautiful Greek boy was the ultimate act of cultural and personal connoisseurship. Antinous was not just a companion. He was the living embodiment of the Hellenic ideal that Hadrian so obsessively admired and, as emperor, so completely dominated. This was the system, brutal and transactional, that plucked a boy from obscurity and placed him at the center of the world, not as a participant, but as a beautiful, tragic exhibit. The city of Claudiopolis, nestled in the fertile lands of Bithynia in modern-day Turkey, was a place of relative quiet. It was a Romanized city, but its soul remained Hellenistic, a legacy of Alexander's conquests. It was here around the year 123 or 124 CE, during one of Hadrian's sweeping tours of the eastern provinces, that the life of one boy was irrevocably altered. We can only imagine the scene. The arrival of the imperial entourage would have been the single greatest event in the city's living memory. Streets would be cleaned, garlands hung, and the entire populace, from the local magistrates to the humblest artisans, would turn out to catch a glimpse of the master of their world. Hadrian, ever the micromanager and talent scout, was known to take a personal interest in the administration and people of the cities he visited. It was likely during a public ceremony, a gymnastic display, or perhaps even an arranged presentation of the region's finest youths, that Hadrian's gaze fell upon Antinous. The boy would have been around 13 or 14 years old, at the peak of adolescent beauty by Roman standards. Youthful, but not childish, with the promise of grace in his every movement. Ancient sources are silent on the specifics of the transaction, but it requires little imagination. His family, likely of humble but respectable Greek stock, would have been faced with an impossible choice that was, in reality, no choice at all. To refuse the emperor's interest in their son would have been unthinkable, an insult of catastrophic proportions. To accept meant surrendering their child, but it also meant securing imperial favor, wealth, and security for the rest of their family beyond their wildest dreams. For the boy Antinous, there was no choice. His body, his future, his life were now the property of the state, embodied in the person of the emperor. He was taken from his home, and the process of his indoctrination began. To be brought into the imperial court was to be plunged into a world of bewildering complexity and lethal intrigue. For a provincial boy, it must have been a terrifying and overwhelming experience. The first order of business was to strip away the old identity. The boy from Bithynia had to be remade into Antinous, the emperor's companion. This was a process of intense education and psychological molding. He would have been assigned tutors of the highest caliber, drilling him in the nuances of court etiquette, in the philosophies of Plato and the Stoics that so fascinated Hadrian, and in the art of conversation. He would have learned to be present but unobtrusive, intelligent but never challenging, beautiful but never vain. His entire existence was to be curated, every gesture and word refined to please a single, all-important audience of one. Isolation was a key tool in this process. He was cut off from his family, his homeland, and anyone who knew him as he was before. His new world was the suffocating bubble of the imperial retinue, a traveling court populated by secretaries, senators, soldiers, slaves, and sycophants. It was a snake pit of jealousy and ambition, and Antinous, as the object of the emperor's obvious affection, would have been the target of immense resentment. Courtiers who vied for a moment of the emperor's attention would have looked upon this boy with a mixture of contempt and fear. Empress Sabina, already trapped in a loveless marriage, reportedly treated him with open disdain. He had no allies, save the one man whose protection was also the source of his bondage. He was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of power, his survival dependent on maintaining the favor of the mercurial, brilliant, and melancholic man who owned him. The daily life of Antinous was a paradox, one of supreme luxury and profound servitude. He lived in quarters that were opulent beyond the dreams of kings, draped in the finest fabrics, eating the most exquisite foods, surrounded by priceless works of art. Yet, he was not the master of this luxury. He was merely its chief ornament. His duties were both simple and crushingly demanding. He was to be a constant companion to the restless emperor. This meant being present at tedious administrative meetings, standing by during endless religious ceremonies, and accompanying Hadrian on his grueling hunts, an activity for which the emperor had a passion. On one famous occasion in Egypt, Hadrian and Antinous confronted a ferocious Marusian lion. When a lion charged Hadrian, Antinous allegedly threw himself in front of the emperor, though Hadrian ultimately dispatched the beast himself. The incident was commemorated in a poem by a courtier, immortalizing Antinous's bravery and devotion, a carefully crafted piece of propaganda that reinforced his role as the loyal, self-sacrificing companion. Beyond these public duties were the private ones. He was Hadrian's confidant, a listener for the emperor's philosophical musings and his dark moods. And he was, without question, his sexual partner. In the Roman context of their relationship, this was an accepted, if unspoken, part of the arrangement. For Antinous, it was another facet of his total subjugation, his body as much the emperor's property as his time and his attention. For roughly 6 years, this was his life, a perpetual journey across the face of the empire. He saw the world not as a traveler, but as baggage, precious, beautiful, and utterly controlled. He walked in a gilded cage that spanned the known world, a prison with the most magnificent views imaginable. The psychological toll of such an existence is difficult to fathom. To be the object of an obsession, even a seemingly benevolent one, is a heavy burden. To be the object of obsession for a man with the power of life and death over the entire world is a weight that could crush the soul. Antinous had to constantly monitor his own behavior, his own appearance, even the natural process of his own aging. The first signs of manhood, a deepening voice, a hardening jawline, the emergence of a beard, were not milestones of maturity, but terrifying harbingers of his own obsolescence. The role of the Eromenos had an expiration date. Roman aesthetics and social norms demanded it. A relationship with a bearded man was not the same. It lacked the specific dynamic of power and aesthetic appeal that defined the institution. This created a terrible, unspoken tension. What would become of him? Hadrian was not known for his sentimentality in casting people aside. Would Antinous be granted a quiet, wealthy retirement, an arranged marriage, and a minor administrative post in some far-flung province? Or would he simply be discarded, replaced by a newer, younger favorite, left to live with the ghost of his former glory? This uncertainty must have gnawed at him, creating a profound sense of precariousness and anxiety. The ancient sources, filtered as they are through Roman sensibilities, hint at a certain melancholy in Antinous' character. The countless statues carved in his image, even those made during his lifetime, often bear an expression of somber, introspective sadness. It is the look of someone who is profoundly alone in a crowd, a beautiful object aware of its own fragility. This internal landscape of fear, isolation, and looming obsolescence formed the backdrop for the final, fateful journey down the Nile in the autumn of the year 130 CE. The end of his service was approaching, and the question of what came next loomed larger and more terrifying than any lion in the desert. The death of Antinous is the dark pivot upon which the entire story turns. It is a moment shrouded in mystery, with historical sources offering conflicting and often sensationalized accounts. The official version, promoted by Hadrian himself, was that it was a simple, tragic accident. On or around October 30th, 130 CE, while the imperial flotilla was on the Nile, Antinous fell into the river and drowned. It is a neat, clean explanation, but one that fails to satisfy. The Nile in that season is not a raging torrent, and a healthy young man, a member of the imperial party surrounded by attendants and guards, does not simply fall from a royal barge and drown without anyone being able to save him. The simplicity of the story feels like a cover, a placid surface concealing darker, more complex currents below. Was he pushed? The court was a nest of vipers, and Antinous, as the emperor's long-standing favorite, would have had many enemies. Jealous courtiers, ambitious rivals, or even agents of the resentful Empress Sabina could have seen an opportunity to remove a key piece from the board. A quiet shove in the darkness, a silent splash, and a problem is solved. While plausible, this theory struggles to explain the sheer magnitude of Hadrian's subsequent reaction. His grief seemed to be more than just for a murdered favorite. It was something deeper, more personal, and more pathological. A simple act of political murder, which an emperor like Hadrian would have been more than capable of investigating and brutally punishing, doesn't seem to fit the scale of what came next. A more esoteric and disturbing theory, hinted at by the historian Cassius Dio, suggests that Antinous' death was no accident or murder, but a deliberate ritual sacrifice. Hadrian was known to be deeply interested in magic, astrology, and the occult mysteries of the East. According to this theory, oracles or magicians had warned the emperor that his life was in danger, and that it could only be prolonged by the voluntary self-sacrifice of someone who loved him deeply. In this telling, Antinous, in an ultimate act of devotion, willingly gave his life to the Nile, a river associated with rebirth and divinity, in a dark magical rite to save his master. This narrative transforms Antinous from a victim of circumstance into a willing martyr for love. It is a powerful and romantic image, one that casts his death in a noble, sacrificial light. However, it is a nobility that is deeply problematic. Can a choice made under such an extreme power imbalance truly be considered voluntary? A boy whose entire existence was defined by his devotion to his master, who had been systematically isolated and indoctrinated for years, might see self-sacrifice not as a choice, but as the final, logical fulfillment of his purpose. His love was a product of his bondage, and therefore his sacrifice would be the ultimate act of that bondage, a coerced martyrdom disguised as devotion. It frames his death as an act of agency, but an agency so twisted by the system of his oppression that it becomes another form of victimhood. The most psychologically compelling theory, and the one that resonates most strongly with a modern understanding of trauma and power dynamics, is that Antinous took his own life. Suicide offers the most coherent explanation for both the event itself and Hadrian's explosive reaction. Imagine the state of mind of the young man on that barge. He was approaching 20, the precipice of Roman manhood. His role, the only identity he had known for his entire adult life, was about to end. He faced a future of terrifying uncertainty, a descent from the pinnacle of the world into, at best, a comfortable obscurity, and at worst, humiliating irrelevance. He was trapped. He could not go back to the life he had before, and the life he had was expiring. Suicide, in this context, becomes a radical, if tragic, act of agency. It was the one final decision he could make that was entirely his own. It was a way to escape the gilded cage, to reclaim his body from the emperor, and to halt the relentless march of time that was threatening to render him worthless. It was a rebellion not against Hadrian the man, whom he may have even felt some form of affection for, but against the brutal system that had defined his existence. By choosing the moment and manner of his own death, Antonius seized control of his narrative in the only way left to him. This act of final defiance would also explain the depth of Hadrian's reaction. It was not just grief, it was a profound, soul-shattering guilt. The suicide of his beloved would have been a terrible indictment of Hadrian himself, a final, silent scream that declared his love to be a suffocating poison. Hadrian's grief was now fused with the horrifying knowledge that he had, through his obsessive possession, driven the object of his affection to self-destruction. Hadrian's response to the death of Antonius was unlike anything the Roman world had ever seen. It was a volcanic eruption of grief, ego, and imperial power that shook the foundations of religion and geography. This was not the quiet, dignified sorrow of a statesman. It was a pathological, public spectacle of mourning on an imperial scale. The emperor, a man known for his stoic reserve and intellectual control, was said to have wept like a woman, a display of emotion that was deeply shocking to the Roman elite. But his tears were only the beginning. His grief was not a passive state. It was an active, creative, and world-altering force. He refused to let Antonius simply be gone. He refused to accept the verdict of death, or perhaps the verdict of suicide. If he could not have the boy in life, he would remake him in death, transforming him into something eternal, something that could never leave him. His retribution was not aimed at a murderer, but at mortality itself. The system of imperial power, which had consumed the boy's life, would now be mobilized to conquer his death. The first and most audacious act was the founding of a city. On the very spot on the Nile where Antonius had died, Hadrian commanded that a new city be built from the ground up, Antinopolis, the city of Antonius. This was an act of breathtaking hubris. Founding a city was a right reserved for emperors and gods, an act of creation that left a permanent mark on the world. Antinopolis was not some minor settlement. It was designed to be a major Greek metropolis in the heart of Egypt. Hadrian personally laid out the street plan in a Hellenistic grid, endowed it with grand temples, a theater, a hippodrome, and public baths. He populated it with Greek settlers, granting them special privileges and legal status, making it a bastion of Hellenic culture in a foreign land. The city was, in essence, a monumental tombstone, a place built to pin the memory of one boy to the map of the world forever. It was an act of geographical mourning, ensuring that the name Antonius would be spoken by merchants, travelers, and citizens for centuries to come, long after the whispers of scandal in the imperial court had faded. The city itself became the boy's primary monument, a living, breathing memorial forged from Hadrian's grief and the inexhaustible resources of the Roman state. Mere geography was not enough. To truly defeat death, Antonius had to be made immortal. In an act that stunned even the polytheistic and relatively flexible Romans, Hadrian declared that Antonius was now a god. He was not just a hero or a demigod, but a full deity worthy of worship. This was a radical and unprecedented step. While emperors themselves were often deified after their death, this was a political process, a vote by the Senate to acknowledge the greatness of a deceased ruler. To deify a non-royal, a provincial boy of no status, and one known primarily as the emperor's sexual favorite, was scandalous. It bypassed all protocol and precedent. Hadrian leveraged his authority as Pontifex Maximus and his absolute power as emperor to force this new cult into existence. Temples to the new god, the deus Antinous, sprang up across the empire, from his new city in Egypt to his birthplace in Bithynia, and even in Rome itself. Priesthoods were established, festivals were decreed, and games were held in his honor. An oracle of Antinous was established at Antinopolis, which quickly became one of the most famous in the ancient world, issuing prophecies and healing the sick. The boy who had been a silent companion in life was now a god who spoke from beyond the grave. To give his new god a face, Hadrian initiated one of the most extensive artistic commissioning programs in history. The imperial workshops were ordered to produce images of Antinous on a massive scale. Sculptors across the empire, from Athens to Alexandria to Rome, began carving his likeness in marble, bronze, and basalt. Coins were minted with his portrait, identifying him as a hero or a god. His image was carved into gemstones and reliefs. The result is a historical anomaly. Antinous is one of the most recognizable figures from all of classical antiquity, with more surviving statues dedicated to him than almost any Roman emperor except Augustus and Hadrian himself. But the face we see is not necessarily the real face of the boy from Bithynia. It is an idealized, perfected image, a fusion of his features with the classical canons of Greek beauty. He is often depicted with a sorrowful, faraway look, his head tilted, his brow heavy with a divine melancholy, an image that perhaps reflected Hadrian's own grief more than Antinous' actual personality. Furthermore, the cult actively promoted syncretism, blending Antinous with established deities to make him more palatable to worshippers. In Egypt, he was fused with Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, making his drowning in the Nile a sacred event. To the Greeks, he was identified with Dionysus, the youthful god of wine and ecstatic abandon, or Hermes, the beautiful messenger of the gods. Through this artistic and religious campaign, Hadrian achieved his goal. The historical boy was systematically erased, replaced by a divine, idealized icon. Antinous the person disappeared, and Antinous the god, a beautiful, tragic, and endlessly reproducible image, was born. He had been commodified in life as a beautiful pet. In death, he was commodified as a god, his image becoming a holy product distributed across the Roman world. The cult of Antinous flourished for a time, fueled by imperial patronage and a genuine appeal, particularly in the Greek-speaking eastern provinces. Here, the story of a beautiful mortal youth transformed into a god resonated with deep-seated myths like those of Ganymede or Hyacinthus. His cult offered a new, more personal and emotional form of worship, centered on a relatable, tragic figure. Pilgrims flocked to his oracle, and his festivals were celebrated with enthusiasm. He was a god of gentle melancholy, a comforting figure for those who had experienced loss. However, the cult's very foundation was also its greatest weakness, its intimate connection to Hadrian. It was seen by many, especially in the more traditionalist Roman West, as the embarrassing indulgence of a grieving emperor, a monument to a scandalous relationship. While people might worship out of respect for the emperor's will, the devotion was often superficial. After Hadrian's death in 138 CE, the official support for the cult evaporated. While it persisted on its own for another century or more, it began a slow, inexorable decline. The final death blow to the cult came not from Roman traditionalism, but from a new, rising faith, Christianity. For early Christian apologists and church fathers, the cult of Antinous was the ultimate embodiment of pagan depravity. They saw it as everything that was wrong with the old world: idolatry, sexual immorality, and the blasphemous worship of a man. Figures like Origen and Tertullian wrote scathing attacks against Antinous, using him as a prime example of pagan foolishness. They mocked his scandalous origins as the emperor's catamite and condemned his worship as a demonic perversion. To them, the deification of a boy famous for an illicit relationship was proof of the moral bankruptcy of the Roman Empire. As Christianity grew in power, it actively sought to erase the vestiges of paganism. Temples to Antinous were destroyed or reconsecrated as churches. His statues were toppled, smashed, or buried. The memory of his cult was suppressed, transformed from the story of a tragic god into a cautionary tale of homosexual sin. The very forces that once made him famous, his beauty and his relationship with Hadrian, were now the reasons for his condemnation. The rise of a new systemic power, Christianity, systematically dismantled the legacy created by the old systemic power of the Roman emperor. Antinous, the boy who was made into a god, suffered a second death, buried under the weight of a new morality, his story relegated to the shadows of history for over 1,000 years. So, how do we remember this boy, retrieved from the dust of history? We are left with a ghost story, a narrative haunted by what is unsaid and unknown. The historical Antinous is almost entirely lost to us. He wrote nothing. His own thoughts, his own voice, are silent. All we have is the shadow he cast, a shape defined by the blinding light of Hadrian's power and obsession. We have the melancholy face of 1,000 statues, an image crafted by his possessor. We have the ruins of a city built as a shrine. We have the condemnations of his enemies and the flowery praises of court propagandists. The boy himself is an absence at the center of his own story, a life consumed and then repurposed as a legend. To look upon a bust of Antinous in a museum is a profoundly unsettling experience. We see one of the most perfect faces ever carved from stone, a masterpiece of Roman art. But we must force ourselves to look deeper, past the polished marble and the idealized features. We must see the systemic violence that underpins this beauty. This is not the face of a lover. It is the face of a victim of exploitation, however gilded that exploitation may have been. It is the face of a boy whose youth and beauty were a resource to be extracted, a commodity to be owned, and ultimately, a memory to be curated and controlled by the most powerful man in the world. The narrative of Hadrian and Antinous has often been framed as one of the great romances of the ancient world, a tragic love story between an emperor and his beloved. But to call a love story is to commit a profound ethical error. It is to ignore the terrifying asymmetry of power that defined their entire relationship. Love, in any meaningful sense of the word, requires a degree of freedom and equality that was utterly impossible between these two individuals. Hadrian was a man in his late 40s, the absolute ruler of the world. Antinous was a teenager, a provincial non-citizen, effectively the emperor's property. He had no power to consent, no power to refuse, and no power to leave. His survival and well-being depended entirely on his ability to please Hadrian. What we call Hadrian's love was an obsessive possession, and what we might call Antinous' devotion was a necessary survival strategy. Their story is not a romance. It is a masterclass in the nature of systemic power. It demonstrates that even with the best of intentions, and Hadrian may well have felt genuine, deep affection, absolute power corrupts the very possibility of a genuine, reciprocal human connection. It transforms people into objects, relationships into transactions, and grief into a grotesque act of public branding. The true, enduring lesson from the life and death of Antinous is a stark and cautionary one. It is about the profound importance of the rights we now take for granted: the right to bodily autonomy, the right to self-determination, the right to be seen as a person and not as property. Antinous lived and died in a world where these concepts did not exist for people like him. He was a beautiful object in a world that prized beautiful objects, and he was ultimately broken by the man who cherished him most. His story compels us to be critical of historical narratives that romanticize power imbalances. It demands that we ask uncomfortable questions about whose voices are preserved and whose are silenced. For every Hadrian who writes his grief across the face of the earth, there is an Antinous whose own story is erased in the process. We have a moral obligation to try and hear that silence, to recognize the humanity that was sacrificed to create the art and the legends that have survived. Remembering Antinous is not just an act of historical curiosity. It is an act of justice. It is to insist on seeing the boy behind the god, the captive behind the companion, the human cost behind the imperial spectacle. It is to acknowledge that the foundations of what we call Western civilization are soaked not only in the blood of conquered armies, but also in the quiet, personal tragedies of the powerless, the used, and the discarded. The story of the boy from Bithynia serves as a timeless and vital reminder that no amount of power, no depth of grief, and no artistic genius can ever justify the consumption of one human life for the emotional or political needs of another. The face of Antinous, carved in countless marbles, is not a monument to love. It is a monument to the power of one man to erase another, to replace a life with a legend, and to force the world to worship his grief. It is the most beautiful, most tragic tombstone ever built, and inside, the boy from Bithynia remains forever silent, a testament to the price of being loved by a god on earth.